Por favor, vayan sentándose, que retomamos las sesiones en esta segunda parte del Congreso. Como siempre, ya saben que el tiempo apremia, así que por favor, acomódense que comenzamos. Tenemos aquí a mi derecha al señor Sudjic, sí, que, como ustedes saben, es el actual director del Museo del Diseño de Londres, una personalidad muy prolífica, autor de numerosos e interesantísimos libros publicados, por supuesto, en castellano. Y aquí a mi izquierda tenemos a Salvador Rueda, ecólogo urbano y actual director de la Agencia de Ecología Urbana. Comenzará el señor Sudjic su intervención, seguidamente, por supuesto, el señor Rueda, y abriremos un pequeño coloquio con todos ustedes.
So I'm afraid I will be speaking in English. It could be worse. It could be the Serbo-Croatian of my parents, in which case the translators would have serious difficulty upstairs. Sadly, I wasn't here yesterday, but as I understand it, yesterday was the day that we had real writers in the room, and today we had real architects in the room. I'm neither of those things. I did study architecture, but I realized quite early on that I was both incompetent and impatient, which is one thing or two things which are fatal to architecture. And on the other hand, as I put it, I never knowingly write fiction. So I try to look at the subject of the city, which I'll be talking about today, from the point of view, I guess, of an observer. And my talk today really is to try and ask some questions and maybe find one or two answers about what the city is at the most basic level. And the city is the word that is used so much that it's almost been rubbed clear of real meaning. When a city can be, when an entity which has 10,000 inhabitants is called a city, and so is Tokyo, which has 40 million inhabitants, it's really quite hard to understand what it is that we're discussing. But certainly the inevitable drive of the last decades is this move towards the city, and we now find ourselves at a time when can one actually call a city the size of Pamplona a city in the same way that we describe Tokyo as a city, or Shanghai, or Beijing? In an encouraging way, we ask ourselves that question, how can a culture flourish in those smaller urban centers? And to that question, I suppose one has to look at the extraordinary example of Pamplona, which has made itself through a very discreet and elegant school of architecture. One might also look back to the days of the Bauhaus in Dessau, which was a city of just 90,000 people, but its view of design culture changed the world. So I'm going to go through a range of ideas about what the city might be, but at the heart, for me, it is an optimistic view. For me, the city has to be about the idea of tolerance. A city is a place in which many cultures can exist side by side and coexist. And I start by showing this image, which has a lot of significance for me as someone who was born in London, but of parents who came from somewhere else. This building was originally built in the 18th century by a group of French Huguenot refugees who brought textile weaving to London, and they built it as a Protestant chapel in their new home, having fled France from the threat of persecution and pogroms. The same building had a second life in the 19th century, first as a Methodist chapel, later as a synagogue, and this building is now run as a mosque in the heart of London. And to me, that is what a city really can be. It's a reflection of how cities operate. And yet, of course, there are many other definitions of cities. Not all cities are about that idea of tolerance and coexistence. On that note, I'd like to quote a couple of examples which come from what we don't normally consider one of the world's most successful pieces of urbanism, but I'm thinking about Battery Park City in Lower Manhattan, which Cesar Pelli master planned back in the 80s as a global financial center with a quite, shall we say, basic master plan. But in it, there was a remarkable art program under the control of Shia Ahmadjani, an Iranian-born sculptor now based in America, who commissioned two great pieces of public art. And they take the form of concrete poetry on the side of the World Financial Center, looking towards New Jersey. There's a set of railings which in them have written two remarkable pieces of poetry, which perhaps provide two very different but equally powerful ideas about what it is that we look for from cities. So they're spelt out in giant letters in cast iron. And the first one is from Walt Whitman, the amazing American poet, which reads as follows: "City of the sea, city of wharves and stores, city of tall facades of marble and iron, proud and passionate city, mettlesome, mad, extravagant city." Who could not warm to that as an idea of the glories of urbanity? But paradoxically, and long before the current President of the United States changed our ideas about what America is, hopefully not forever, there were two lines which Whitman put at the beginning of that verse, which are not there by the World Financial Center. And those two lines are crucial. City of the world, for all races are here. All the lands of the earth make contributions here. Just down the road from that is another verse from another very different poet, one who provides a much more perhaps intimate idea of what New York might be. And that's Frank O'Hara. "One need never leave the confines of New York to get all the greenery one wishes. I can't even enjoy a blade of grass unless I know there's a subway handy, or a record store, or some other sign that people do not totally regret life." So not all cities have these qualities. Some cities, of course, were started as the hearts of empires. This is Moscow from the air. The Kremlin, originally a stockade in the 13th century, is still a center of power, and it's the classic authoritarian model of a city at which at the heart is the palace or the court, around the edges are the lawyers and the merchants, and around that are the workers. And it's a model that you still also find in Beijing, where the heart of power is still adjacent to the imperial city, where Mao Zedong created Tiananmen Square as a gesture to say that this was a new socialist state. Or you can see cities that which had religious or academic foundations, and those are in some ways similar. So this is Oxford, this is Isfahan, where the university and its tradition of learning, again, comes from religion. There are merchant cities, some of which are more successful than others. This is the notorious picture of Detroit, which actually began as a harbor city on the lakes. Its great age of prosperity was so brief that it was only one generation deep as an industrial city. And this is Hamburg, which has actually managed to reinvent itself more effectively, investing massively in architecture in the harbor. And how are cities started? Well, sometimes they are started by single individual authoritarians. This is Peter the Great, who started St. Petersburg as Russia's window to the world. He went to Amsterdam to learn how to build a model industrial city, and he got the canals right, but perhaps didn't bring back the idea of tolerance as a major urban element. You can see how tiny numbers of individuals can start a city. This is the beach at what is now called Tel Aviv, where the founding families, refugees from Europe, sat on the beach one day to work out who would get to build what and where. And they created this, which is how it is now. You can see cities started by, for political reasons, Brasilia, the most extraordinary example, of modernist planning, which goes through every detail. I'm particularly fascinated by the way that the Brazilians decided that modernity meant a very different address system, which has blocks and numerals and codes, which make it impossible for an outsider to navigate. A city which has at its heart the foundation myth of the city. You can find Juscelino Kubitschek, the president of Brazil, who built this capital as a fulfillment of the constitution, which said that the country would move away from its reflections on Europe and set up its base in the heart of the country. You can see ideas of cities that come from popular culture. This is the extraordinary World's Fair. New York actually had two, one before World War II and one after, both of which actually had major things to say about how we understand cities. This is one of my favorite images, which shows the collision between urbanism and entertainment. In this moving Ford Galaxy on tracks, which goes around a gigantic model of the city, you will find Robert Moses, Walt Disney, and Henry Ford, who between them have probably had more impact on the nature of the world's cities than anybody, until perhaps Steve Jobs. And here is their nemesis, Jane Jacobs, who really ushered in that moment of believing that grand plans were not what a society needed to create livable cities. And that was the first collision between two extraordinarily different ideas about what urbanism might be. Disney, of course, was famously obsessed by the idea of town planning. He wanted to build, quote-unquote, a real city. In some ways, it resembled some of the more crude interpretations of what Jane Jacobs' city might be. It's remarkable that Disney died before his heirs and successors could start to actually build a quote-unquote real city, and even more remarkable that it was to Aldo Rossi they turned for architectural and planning advice on what it might be. Cities invent themselves and imagine themselves. This is New York presented as the great model. It always makes me think, actually, this image and this also, which is Shanghai, of that scene in the first version of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Harrison Ford finds himself inside a pyramid with the map room of the pharaohs. And from this scale, there is that sense that cities are made by politicians and by individuals, no matter how unlikely that is. And this is Beijing's version of the same idea of what is the city going to be like at a time when it didn't really exist. What is it that gives a city identity? Sometimes they're really random, unexpected aspects of bureaucracy. This is the man who's done a lot to give the world and London itself the idea of what it is. He was an electrical engineer in the offices of the London Transport System in the 1920s, when the system was becoming so complex that no one could understand the map. And he had the idea of using electrical symbols to create a diagram of what the London Underground network was, so that it could be navigated effectively. Well, what he eventually came up with has become as much part of London's identity as its red buses and its taxis and its policemen. It's become the way that Londoners understand their city, and it helps foreigners navigate it. It's become a sign and a symbol for what London is, and one which has been reflected by many other cities. There is a Marxist interpretation of this map, which points out that Beck's idea of spacing all the stations at the same distance apart on the diagram makes it possible to read the names effectively in the city centre. But of course, at the outer edges, it distorts distance completely, and it actually makes the outer edges look much closer to the centre than they really are, which some people somewhat paranoidly suggest might be something to do with the fact that this was the area in which new housing was being built for sale at the time the map was produced. It can't be true. And I said earlier that, who's actually affected the shape of the city more than any others, and we have to say in this that the way we navigate the city, the way we understand the city, has been changed utterly by the smartphone, which is now only 11 years old. 1.5 billion have been sold from Apple alone in that time. And this has changed the way that we navigate the city, it's changed the way that we consume, it's changed the way that we meet each other. It's also, I think, had some really extraordinary, unexpected effects on us in the way that you could say that what we thought of with social media was initially presented as some kind of liberating force that had actually triggered the Arab Spring, has had some very un-urban effects. Social media have in some respects pushed us back into a pre-modern moment. You could describe Twitter as the digital lynch mob. And to me, one of the essential aspects of a city is that sense of its acceptance and its ability to make its citizens anonymous, to take from the city what they need and to avoid what they don't need from it. With no privacy, that city has become a very different entity. And I think now we're in a moment when the digital world needs to think about how it might begin to restore some of those lost qualities. There's an extraordinarily political aspect to the way that we make cities. This man is Henri Prost, a French planner who worked initially in North Africa. He planned Marrakesh as the European quarter, and he was hired by the Turkish secular regime after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire to replan Istanbul to give it a more Western quality. Kemal Ataturk extraordinarily abolished Arabic script, changed the national dress, and created a new foundation, pre-Islamic myth for Istanbul. And this is really an explanation for some of the arguments that we see in contemporary Turkey. The Gezi Park riots were presented initially as being a case of activists protesting at the loss of a green space within a city to replace it with a shopping mall. Actually, of course, what was really going on was that President Erdogan, who is trying to recast a very different image of what Turkey is and Istanbul is, was planning to build on the park, the Gezi Park that Prost created and demolished in the process the square you see on the top left, which was an Ottoman barracks. And the protest erupted when Erdogan wanted to rebuild those as a reminder of what the Turkey he wanted has become. And you can see similar transformations in many cities. This is Moscow in the late 19th century. This is the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, the largest church in Russia, built to commemorate Russia's victory over Napoleon. Tchaikovsky composed the 1812 overture to celebrate this building's completion. And when the capital of the Soviet Union moved from St. Petersburg back to Moscow, Stalin set about transforming Moscow from a city of the czars and religion into the Vatican of socialism, and blew up the largest church in Russia and started to replace it with Boris Yeltsin's extraordinary landmark, which would have been taller than the Empire State Building, topped by Lenin, who'd have been larger than the Statue of Liberty, pointing at his tomb. He got as far as the 11th floor when the Germans invaded, and after the war, Khrushchev not only rejected Stalin's politics, but his architecture as well, and he turned the foundations into Moscow's largest open-air swimming pool. And then, the story doesn't end there, of course, because in post-Soviet Russia, Mayor Lushkov of Moscow set about rebuilding the cathedral that had been destroyed by Stalin with a replica of what had been there before. And this, of course, is the building in which Pussy Riot were arrested for protesting at Putin's links with the Orthodox Church. So these are the ways in which there's a very clear connection between planning, urbanism, architecture, and the nation state. I'm also fascinated by accidents and unintended consequences, how unforeseen developments happen without a real will on anyone's part. So this is the London docks, circa 1983, which at one time had accounted for a third of Europe's shipping, and every upstream dock in the world was wiped out by a piece of very low-tech technology, the shipping container, which of course was about speeding up shipments, speeding up world trade, but a seriously low-tech piece of equipment. But it made every upstream dock in the world redundant because they were too small for ships to get access. So within 10 years, what had been the busiest port in Britain became a wasteland. So desperate was the government to do something about it that they seriously considered turning it into a gigantic park. And then there was the idea of an enterprise zone, which offered huge planning incentives and tax gains to try and encourage anybody to build here. And the government thought if they were lucky, they would get some low-rise industrial sheds. But what they eventually got was another urban centre for London, because one of the early bankers who'd been invited to invest in some of those low-tech sheds realized that the same planning incentives could be used not just to create industrial sheds, but high-rise buildings. And suddenly London had this second financial centre, which is now employs 140,000 people and is probably Europe's third financial centre after central London and Frankfurt. But this happened without anybody expecting it, without anybody knowing it, and it triggered off at the same time another change of regime within the city square mile of London, which didn't want to see its predominance as Britain's financial centre threatened by these upstarts down the river in the wasteland of the docks. So they completely reversed their planning policies for central London, which allowed, the previous policy had been to build behind existing facades, to maintain low-rise building only, and this was reversed. And of course, if you had a choice between coming out here and going to the centre of London, it became very hard to sell the buildings here, which triggered the bankruptcy of the original developers here. So things often happen by accident. No one voted for London skyline to be transformed on this level, but the first mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, did go to Shanghai, and he did go to Dubai, and he saw that his plans to make London the unchallenged world financial centre, in his eyes, needed not just the jobs, but also the visible signage of this alleged symbol of a thrusting city skyline. And so we see Hong Kong or the Emirates becoming interchangeable skylines that act as advertising hoardings. But some things don't change. This is the remarkable allegory of good and bad government in Siena's Palazzo Pubblico, painted in the 1400s by Ambrogio Lorenzetti, who actually confronted the government of Siena. Every day they met in their council chamber with images of the city as well-governed, thriving, full of life and merchants, and the city badly governed, with brigands and muggers and houses falling into decay. And the basics of good government are not different. People want to live in cities where they can actually enjoy a level of security, in which there is the rule of law, in which there's a sense of actually getting on with their neighbours, in which there is an honest banking system, in which there might be education. And those things remain the same and remain as relevant in the Europe of the 14th century as they would for slum dwellers on the peripheries of Sao Paulo or Shanghai. I began by talking also about how maybe the ideas of architects and planners and critics like myself are, as ways of interpreting and understanding the city, are sometimes inadequate, and maybe artists or maybe writers can tell us more about the nature of urban transformations as any planner. So we learn as much about Paris of the 19th century from Zola and artists of that period as we do from Haussmann. From cinema, this is Rod Steiger in one of my favorite films, Hands Over the City, which is a fascinating account of corruption, planning and development in post-war Naples. Dickens, of course, described a London look like this, and he tells us as much about London then as it does now. I live in a part of North London which is exactly as Dickens described it, as a neighbourhood cut through by the coming of the railways with a gash in the urban fabric. There's other more recent writers on architecture in the city who maybe do come from the architectural camp. This, of course, is contemporary Las Vegas, not quite the city which Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi so eulogized in Learning from Las Vegas. They were there when, at a time, I suppose, when the city was still neon and innocent, and it's now become backlit LEDs in a very much less innocent city. But without them, we would understand cities very differently. I would also have to talk about Rainer Banham's understanding of the cities, perhaps the first European writer to go to Los Angeles and reverse the conventional wisdom that Los Angeles is a place full of anonymous pollution and lack of urbanity. Banham went and decided that the exact opposite was the case, that it was actually a city full of possibilities and movement. He was a wonderful observer of people. He talked about how, watching drivers in Los Angeles, they would treat the freeways as private space and ramp level coming down into the surface streets as public space on the basis of watching people putting on their makeup in the mirror of their cars before they went off the freeways and down onto the surface. I also especially love Banham's wonderful observation that he learnt to drive so that he could read Los Angeles in the original language, which is a very nice way to put it. And now we have Ram Koolhaas doing his best to make sense of Lagos, perhaps not really achieving it as yet. And then finally to come to places where we now have to go to, I mean, if Las Vegas and Los Angeles and Lagos were the places that we had to go once to try and understand where the city was moving, now it has to be Silicon Valley, and this most unlikely seed, Stanford University, with Olmsted's wonderful landscaping, which is probably why Silicon Valley has now become the place in which the world's most valuable companies are all headquartered. This is Stanford University, which is what produced the people that produced Google and all the others. It's near the campus was the Xerox Research Park, which is where the graphic user interface came from, and it's where Norman Foster has recently completed Apple's headquarters. This is in Cupertino, which is a city which only existed from 1955 onwards. It has 55,000 citizens. And can we understand this as a city at all? Would it exist without San Francisco, which is 50 miles away, which, if you count in all the suburbs, is probably a city of about 2 or 3 million people? Is that what makes it work? Or do we understand this single building, which probably has a population not that different from Siena when that allegory was painted, as a kind of new urban form, which is perhaps a monastery and a university run into one? It's always instructive to compare Apple with a formerly great electronics company, which no longer exists, Olivetti. This is the Corso Venezia in Milan, where Olivetti maintained their 2 great design studios, one of Mario Bellini's, the other of Ettore Sottsass. And they had their studio in an 18th century building in the middle of a city, and Olivetti allowed them to work for other people at the same time. It's quite a different model from this. But of course, Apple is the most valuable company on the planet, and Olivetti no longer exists. And these are some of the other built forms which we see taking shape. This is Frank Gehry's project with Facebook. This is Google's no longer current project with Big and Thomas Heatherwick. I was actually in Silicon Valley at the time of one of the World Series American football matches. And what was really noticeable was that the city on that night was just crammed with people. There's something about humans which actually makes them want to look for crowds. And there's one thing that you won't find in Cupertino, it's a crowd. So it needs that we still need that sense of the crowd. This is Cairo at the height of the Arab Spring, which we can see as the beneficial crowd. This is the impact of mass tourism, which is beginning to choke all our cities. This is the Louvre, which is now working on handling an unimaginable £10 million a year, 10 million visitors a year. What kind of experience is that? And this is the kind of darker side of what the crowd can be. So I've taken us on a tour of the horizon. I've asked some questions about what cities are, what do they need. Some things I think always remain the same. That sense of tolerance, to me, which is the essential quality of a city which will thrive and flourish. But we are now also at a time when the social media are threatening our sense of urbanity, that sense of being able to live the lives that we choose, not a life lived entirely under the scrutiny of others. Thank you. While Salvatore returns?
Sí, mientras llega nuestro segundo ponente, quizá puedo permitirme el lujo de hacerle una pregunta. Mr. Sudzic, I make it in English so you can understand. So, yes, I found most interesting what you've mentioned about tolerance, since I think one of the main constructive points in a city is communication. So if we bear in mind that the way we communicate is changing, the way we approach each other is dramatically changing. You've mentioned our mobile phones, and of course we have a lot of apps, and we have also Amazon. So how are these new ways of communication reshaping our cities? And is it in spite of architects, or is it because of architects?
Well, as we saw this morning, Airbnb has completely transformed the character of many cities, which is entirely beyond architecture. Airbnb is now considering a new building type, which is building rental apartments in newly designed blocks. Physically, I was in Beijing last week, and they are beginning to introduce lanes for pedestrians who are trapped by their smartphones and have turned into zombies, abdicating their responsibilities as pedestrians. And yet, architecture is not only about the physical world, and I think architects have a role to play in finding ways to integrate that technology. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Was it something I said?
I can start?
Okay, yeah. But we will go on, of course.
No, I think we'll carry on this later.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.